Can I introduce you?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, this is Angela with Parker's Permaculture, and I'm here with my daughter, B. We are going to do a little bit of a special segment today. So normally this is House File Friday, and I talk about the way that permaculture ethics interplay with our home, the domestic sphere, the family, our role in the community, etc. And this morning, the Supreme Court issued a ruling that impacts our community and every community across America. And this is an area where B has a lot of expertise and I don't. So she generously offered to sit down for a few minutes to help explain the Grants Pass ruling that just came down this morning and how it might impact folks in your community and ours. So B, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and why you are someone who's really knowledgeable in this area.
Yeah, so I currently work at a place called Sisters of the Road. I'm just an intern, but part of my job, I guess, as an intern was taking these court cases, and I wrote some articles on them. I made these PowerPoints which sort of explained what the rulings meant. Mm-hmm. So I've done quite a bit of research into this and how it affects how it used to affect people and how it will affect people now that this has been overturned.
Mm-hmm. So the case that we are talking about now was a case that originated here in Oregon and then moved up through the Ninth Circuit and then finally to the Supreme Court. So that's one of the reasons that you have really studied this case, because it originated here, and you work for Sisters, which is a nonprofit that does advocacy work for homeless folks in our community. And this case is about rights for homeless people and the laws around camping specifically, right?
Yes.
So you're very knowledgeable about all of the laws that impact homeless people in Oregon. And one of your jobs is to create literature and educational materials for homeless folks so that they know their rights under Portland law and under Oregon state law and Ninth Circuit and federal law.
Yes.
Okay.
I wouldn't say I know everything about this subject in our country in Oregon, but I do know a little bit more than maybe the average person, and I've researched this specific case.
You've been following this case really closely.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about the Grants Pass case and the ruling that came down?
Okay, yes. So, Grants Pass is a case that was first and foremost based on another case. So before there was Grants Pass, there was Martin v. Boise. And in Boise, Idaho, this group of homeless people had been arrested or fined for sleeping outside when there was nowhere else to go. And so they sued, and they said that's unconstitutional under the 8th Amendment, which protects against cruel and unusual punishment. They said if we have nowhere else to go, you can't fine us, you can't punish us.
So basically, like, if there's no shelter beds.
Yes. No reasonable shelter.
And they can't afford a hotel. They have no home. Mm-hmm. And there's no shelter beds, no reasonable shelter. Mm-hmm. They have no other choice but to camp. It's cruel and unusual punishment to then penalize them for camping, right?
Yes.
Okay.
For sleeping outside, essentially on public property.
Okay.
This doesn't affect private property.
Mm-hmm. It's
public property, so think mainly sidewalks and parks.
Okay.
Was the main place, or underpasses and stuff.
Okay.
Though it's not like you can camp anywhere.
Okay.
And Martin v. Boise made it all the way up to the Ninth Circuit, which means it affected only the Ninth Circuit area of the United States. So think California, Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and I think a few other places. Okay. There are other circuits that govern other areas. The circuit courts are basically the step between state courts and Supreme Court.
Okay.
Circuit courts are like Supreme Courts, but for several states. They're state Supreme Courts, but circuit courts, their rulings affect those states, and their rulings are the official rulings unless it makes it to the Supreme Court.
Gotcha.
And the Supreme Court is for the whole country. Ninth Circuit Court came down with Martin v. Boise, and they said, I believe it was 2-1, they said, this is cruel and unusual. You can't just punish somebody for just trying to sleep outside when there is nowhere else for them to go, right? But they didn't necessarily say, what are the other restrictions you can put on this? Daytime camping bans, what materials someone can have, what constitutes like objectively reasonable shelter. And so that brings us to Grants Pass. Now, Grants Pass, Oregon said, basically, okay, you can sleep outside, but we disagree that you can have bedding. You can't have like a sleeping bag or a pillow or a blanket or a tent. And so that made it all the way up. People sued, right? And that made it up to the Ninth Circuit.
Can I interrupt you for a second? So people who aren't familiar with Oregon, the city of Grants Pass has cold, snowy, icy winters and very hot, dry summers. So they're basically saying you can camp outside, but you can't have bedding in the middle of winter.
Yes.
Okay.
At any time.
Yeah. So
you can't have like a tent to block the sun, Ninth Circuit came back and they said, we disagree. So for a while, that was the Ninth Circuit's ruling. And that sort of set another precedent that like cities had to adjust to in the Ninth Circuit. But the Supreme Court decided to pick it up because, well, they had rejected Martin v. Boise before, I should say, if I remember correctly.
They declined to hear it.
They declined to hear it.
Okay.
But with Grants Pass, it became very interesting because there were people from both sides of the aisle that said, we want you to step in and we want you to overrule. There was like Republicans and there was like Gavin Newsom and California, and like they really wanted Grants Pass overturned because these big cities didn't want homeless people on the streets.
But they also didn't want to increase shelter beds or give them financial support to find permanent housing, correct? Yeah.
So there were a couple questions before the Supreme Court, all right? There was the question of, if Martin v. Boise stands, then are people allowed shelter along with that? There was the main question, which is, if it's cruel and unusual to punish someone for sleeping outside when there is no shelter, then there was, what constitutes reasonable shelter if you decide that that is the case, if Martin v. Boise does stand. And there was also the question of what's called a living constitution or a living Eighth Amendment. Basically, Martin v. Boise would be a very progressive reading of the Constitution. It's like broadening the reach of what cruel and unusual punishment means, because obviously there hadn't been a ruling on this specific issue before. So a living constitution or a living Eighth Amendment is the idea that the Constitution evolves as we evolve, and that's how the Founding Fathers intended it, because society was going to change, and they knew society was going to change. And so certain definitions had to change, like free speech, right? Social media wasn't around back then, but it is free speech still. Then is doxing free speech? Is this free speech? So it's like adapting to the new rules. Then on the flip side of that, there is originalists, which believe that the Constitution's original intent is what mattered. It's, it's specific original definitions. And that's where that's a very more conservative point of view. That's like Clarence Thomas is a huge originalist. If you look at that recent ruling on gun rights, right, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1, abusers can't have firearms, like people with restraining orders. And Clarence Thomas disagreed because from his originalist perspective, the Constitution wouldn't have considered that when it was originally written. Does that make total sense? No, I disagree. I think this is going to be a tangent, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Well, and 8 members of the Supreme Court disagreed with Justice Thomas as well. Yeah.
What I think people need to understand about the Constitution is that a real originalist, in my opinion, would be someone that understands the Constitution is meant to change, because that was the original intent. The Founding Fathers didn't think we're going to rule the same. So you think a
real originalist would have been someone who believed in a living Constitution?
That's what I believe.
Yeah.
That's a tangent for another day.
Okay. So get us back to Grants Pass, and when the Supreme Court heard this case, basically they're deciding whether or not people can camp, and what constitutes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. to bring us back to this case, the Supreme Court was deciding whether or not it is cruel and unusual punishment to punish someone when there is nowhere to sleep. And if they had agreed with that, they also would have been deciding maybe what is objectively reasonable shelter. What can those restrictions be, you know? Obviously, we didn't get there. Ruling came down today. It's not how it looked.
So tell us what the ruling was. I know it was 6-3.
It was 6-3 in favor of Grants Pass. So essentially overruling Martin v. Boise. Now, I should say, if you're in Portland, and I think some of your viewers are, this largely won't affect us because we have state law. Any camping regulations within the city must be objectively reasonable. But for the rest of the country, we don't really have that, right? So this is really going to affect places like California and Arizona, where they have really been, like, itching, sort of, and honestly, Oregon, if we're being, like, super for real. Where they've really been like wanting to sweep these big encampments because there is not enough shelter.
This ruling B, so this means now that anywhere across America, someone who lives in a community where they have insufficient shelter beds and someone can't get a spot in a shelter and they don't have a home, they can be penalized for sleeping outside on public property. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
It is no longer considered unreasonable to penalize them.
So basically, the ruling, from what I've been reading up on today, and I haven't read the full thing yet because it's 74 pages, but I've been reading articles going over it, was writing for the majority. And he said, and just because he writes for the majority doesn't necessarily mean all the judges on the majority wrote the same way. I haven't seen if there's any other concurring opinions. He basically said, because the camping laws affect everyone and they aren't just targeting homeless people, it's not cruel and unusual punishment, they're just camping laws.
Except that everybody else has somewhere to go at night and homeless people don't.
Yeah. And one of the other judges said, like, homelessness isn't like a class. So...
not a protected class?
Yeah. So even if it were a protected class, it might be a little different because there's disparate impact. So if the law had disparate impacts that affected them, you know,
if they were a protected class, then it would be perhaps be a different ruling.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they're not. Homelessness isn't a class. It is like a state. You can't, in the same way, you can't punish an addict for simply being an addict. You can't punish someone just for being homeless, but you can punish the actions they take, which is why you can't punish someone for having an addiction, but you can punish someone for possessing drugs, right? So that was essentially their reasoning of why it's not cruel and unusual.
Okay. So as somebody who works in homeless advocacy, what do you think the consequences are going to be for communities across America?
Well, it really depends on the community. I think first and foremost, we're going to see a lot more sweeping of camps and criminalization, basically, of being homeless. People who have nowhere else to go, it's now going to be framed as like, well, we're taking them off the streets now. This is how we're dealing with.
So by sweeping them and then what, expecting them to move along somewhere else?
Well, no, it's not just sweeping camps. It's like punishments. It's like fines, it's jail time.
I'm going to jump in there. So fines that homeless people we know don't have the resources to pay, and jail time that we know costs taxpayers more than if we had simply housed homeless people in the first place.
Yeah.
So this ruling is going to cost taxpayers more money and is not going to solve the homeless crisis.
Yes. It's also going to affect other Eighth Amendment rulings. So this is now sort of clarified some Eighth Amendment questions. In this case, they referenced a case from California, I think, where a man had been, had been charged with being an addict in the state. At the time, it had been illegal, I think it was the 60s, it had been illegal to have the status of an addict. And the Supreme Court had ruled, well, you can't make it illegal to have a status, right?
So now this ruling means that it will have implications for other cases involving the Eighth Amendment.
Yes.
Okay.
Because this has now once again sort of clarified that you can't outlaw status, but laws that affect everybody, you know.
As someone who's very familiar with this subject matter, right, and you've studied this a lot, you work in this field, and who, what would you want to say to folks watching, particularly folks who might be like my viewers, who are very interested in sustainable, resilient communities? Because the homeless crisis in America is a real problem in every major city in America, right? It's a real problem. So, you know, if we're looking for solution-based thinking, if we are actually trying to solve the crisis instead of penalizing people, what do you see as just a couple of things that communities could be doing differently to effectively address this issue?
I think first and foremost, there needs to be more shelter and also more long-term housing solutions and more treatment. I think it can be really hard for communities to sort of grapple with the idea of both, you know, wanting to help homeless people, but also really seeing them as a nuisance and sort of squaring those two, because there are situations where someone on drugs could be dangerous or like they might make stuff more unclean because they don't have a bathroom.
Or like a few streets away from us, there's a significant camp that gets swept all the time, and there are frequently fires up there because folks are trying to cook.
Yeah.
And it's not an adequate, safe setting to be having open flames, so it does pose a safety risk.
And if you think punishment is like part of the answer, if you think, well, these fines, you know, they'll get them out of the way, they really won't, right? Because the issue is not that these people don't want help. A lot of these people do. It's that there's not enough temporary shelters that are accessible, right? And I would encourage anybody who's listening to this to look into why shelters aren't accessible. There's so much testimonials of people talking about, you know, this shelter required us to participate in a religious practice I can't do. This shelter wasn't safe for women. This shelter wasn't safe for children. They didn't let me bring my pets in. They didn't let me stay with my partner there.
I've seen a number of folks who say that shelters can be segregated by gender and therefore split families up. It's a bed, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a safe place to go.
So communities maybe need to work to make more shelters and more accessible shelters available, and also more long-term housing. I know some places have taken big steps to that, but at the same time, they're also sort of, we're not doing that in a lot of places.
I think there was a study, I'll see if I can cut it in here or drop it down below, like in Denver, where they gave homeless people $1,000 a month for a year, and it would be cheaper to give people money and what they will do with it is not use more drugs. They will find housing with that money. It's cheaper to do that than to incarcerate people or to hire companies to sweep camps and hire more police. It's cheaper to literally give people money and they will go find their own housing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think also looking into, and this is sort of tangentially related, but looking into the fentanyl crisis, because I think many homeless people tend to be addicts. It's really easy to sort of dehumanize them and not look at them as people because they're struggling with addiction or mental health, right?
One of the things I was really surprised to learn is how many of the homeless people in Portland are actually from rural Oregon, and how many of the homeless folks, especially homeless youth in Portland, are one, really vulnerable to trafficking. I was talking about this on my TikTok, but two, are often kids who come from unsafe home situations. They might be queer youth, they might be subject to child abuse and neglect where they are, and they flee to the city. And those kids have a lot of trauma, and they're much more likely to be trafficked or to become substance users, right?
Yeah.
Because of all that trauma. So I know for me, like from a permaculture perspective, if we want to fix the homeless crisis, we have to look all the way back to how families are operating and the support we give parents. You can tell what
like an ACEs score.
What's that?
It's a score that sort of determines like how at risk you are. What are the factors that go into making someone become homeless in the first place? back to my point though. You know, I bring up drug addiction because you can't really separate the two. You know, if you want to deal with one, you also have to address the other. And both of them, the solution for both of them is not punishment. The solution is making accessible help and long-term solutions and preventative help. So they're very much intertwined in that way. And so now that we're looking at, well, more homeless people are now going to be punished for what I would argue is being homeless. We need to now look at what are the ways we can help them to make sure they aren't punished. And as a community, I think honestly, shelter would be great. Treatment would be great. Supporting legislation that helps them rather than criminalizes them. Supporting politicians that run on a platform of helping homeless rather than just like sweeping this. Yeah. Rather than just running on platforms of let's like clean up the city in like a bad way.
Well, but also those politicians are like shooting themselves in the foot because it doesn't actually, like, they're not addressing the root causes of homelessness. They're just doing something that's very performative, right? We're going to sweep these camps. They'll be back in a week or two because we haven't actually cured and found solutions for the reasons that so many people in America are homeless in the first place. So it makes politicians look good in the short term, but it's costing cities tremendous amounts to like invest in cleaning up, but it's not fixing the problem, right? So it's money that has to be spent over and over and over and over again because you're not fixing the problem.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any last thoughts?
Yes. My closing thought, I think, is that this election, like all elections this year, is going to matter a lot. Right now, we have a super majority of conservative, for the most part, originalist federalists on the Supreme Court. Most of them got there from the Federalist Society, right? It was a 6-3 ruling, and that really shows the political ideologies of both of those groups and how they choose, how those politics influence sort of their reading of the Constitution. As much as we want that to be apolitical, it's not, because it is a very political document.
You make a really good point, because a lot of people say that permaculture shouldn't be political, but everything in life is political, right? And we're seeing the fallout of people choosing not to be involved in the democratic process, or choosing to be very glib about it and say, like, it doesn't matter if I vote, or like the system will just keep on going as it always has been. But choosing not to vote and choosing what elected officials, how you engage in the electoral democratic process, like, has real consequences for people's lives and for communities, right? So it's easy to be jaded and not want to participate, or to say, like, I'm just going to opt out of voting, or I'm going to opt out of participating because the system is so corrupt or whatever. But the way that we vote actually has real consequences, not only in the lives of individuals, but in our communities.
Yeah, okay. Our company. Even though I work at Sisters, I don't necessarily represent the views or the position of the organization. These are my own beliefs, but I did learn it through working at Sisters and doing that research for them. Yeah,
you're totally speaking as an individual, but you're using the knowledge that you've gained at your work and through your interest in the Supreme Court and case law in general. Thank you, B, for taking time to talk about this. And thanks so much for watching today. Thanks, B, for hanging out and explaining to us. When we think about permaculture and we think about having those 3 ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share, that includes sustainable communities. It's not just about gardening. It's not apolitical. The choices that we make have real ramifications for our lives, for our neighbors, for our cities. So I think it's requisite for us to be involved in the political process. So I thank you for taking the time to come and explain. Again, don't forget to click like and subscribe. Please check out my TikTok, and I will be back really soon. Thanks.
Oh, and if you're in Portland, please check out the article I wrote on Measure 110.
Oh yeah, I'll link to it down below.